Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's event on cataloguing Ethiopian manuscripts. I'm Katie Blackwood. I'm Secretary of the Arliss and Cataloguing Classification Committee, and today's event is organised by us as part of a series on cataloguing and classification ethics. This is the last talk in the series, and all will be being made available on YouTube. And thank you to the other members of the committee for organising this talk. There will be time for questions at the end of this talk, and please put any questions you have into the Q&A as you think of them. At the end, we'll read them out for Ayob to answer. And I'll now hand over to Annalisa to introduce Ayob.
Thank you, Katie. Good evening all, and welcome back to the last appointment with our series Cataloguing and Classification Ethics. I am Annalisa Ricciardi. I am a member of the Arliss Cataloguing and Classification Committee and the cataloger for the Americas and Oceania office at the British Library. Ethiopian Cataloguing Systems and Colonial Impact is the title of today's talk, and it is presented by Ayob Dirillo. Ayob is curator for Ethiopic and Ethiopian collections at the British Library. Sorry. He is responsible for the library's collection of printed Ethiopian books and Ethiopian manuscripts, produced from the 13th to the early 20th century. He has also co-curated the British Library's exhibition Harry Potter, History of Magic, and afterwards, African Scribes, Manuscript Culture of Ethiopia, the first exhibition held at the British Library devoted entirely to Ethiopian manuscripts. Ayob's doctoral research focuses on the nature and historical development of the concept of Ethiopian magic and its use within a specifically Christian context. His particular area of expertise includes Ethiopian history from the 15th to the 19th century, Ethiopian manuscript illumination, Ge'ez literature, an ancient Ethiopian Semitic language originated from what is now northern Ethiopian Eritrea, and liturgical and hagiographical text of medieval period. Today, Ayob will give an overview on the history of cataloguing Ethiopian manuscripts and will discuss the challenges with an emphasis on the colonial overwriting. Handing over to you, Ayob, now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Lisa. The purpose of my talk today is to counter the racist myth and colonial overwriting that nothing good came out of Africa. The 19th century French anthropologist Paul Bourka stated that, quote, "A group of a black skin has never been able to raise itself spontaneously to civilization," end quote. All manners of disparaging stereotypes have been successfully assigned to both the cultures and the people of Africa, with the aim of steering public opinion towards the flawed view that Africans are all altogether inferior, lacking history, culture, and so on. Africans have been widely portrayed and perceived as inherently savage, primitive, barbarian, and uncivilized. Unfortunately, some of these stereotypes have survived to this present day. These false notions about Africans were held also by highly respected figures in European and American history, including Christian theologians, ministers, writers, historians, politicians, academics, and even scientists. For example, the German philosopher Hegel, and his work, Lectures on the Philosophy of the World, described Africa as culturally backward, and the African whom he called, quote, "animal man," end quote, as living in barbarism and savagery. Even Immanuel Kant described Africans as people, quote, "by nature, no feeling that arises above the trifling," end quote. We could go on all day giving such examples. All these racist comments that have implied or openly expressed the view that Africans are somehow intrinsically uncivilized shamelessly ignore the massive body of well-documented historical facts literature to the contrary. In my talk, I hope on the Ethiopian manuscript, some of these views will be dismantled, particularly the racist ideology that nothing good came out of Africa. To do this, I aim to set out and describe the British Library's collection of Ethiopian manuscripts and the challenges and the current opportunities of cataloging these manuscripts. And furthermore, I want to also emphasize the role that curators, catalogers, working with African collections books or even museum objects can play an important role in dismantling this colonial overwriting through catalog description of items and making them easily accessible to the public. Just to give you some scope and content, background to the Ethiopian collection at the British Library, it is the largest collection of manuscripts of indigenous language from Africa, beside Arabic. There is a total of over 550 manuscripts. This has been recently updated, and I've written a collection guide on the website. You could have a look. And we also have very important printed books, some of them dating from the 16th century. Those books were printed in Europe. All in all, the Ethiopian collection is found throughout the library, from maps to sound recordings, where we have early recordings of the King Menelik of Ethiopia, and the Indian Office Library, which also my colleagues last week from the Qatar project covered. We also have a number of important documents relating to Ethiopian politics in the Indian Office. The first collection that was given to the British Library or donated is the Harleian collection, known as the Foundation Collection. The Harley collection forms what we call the foundation collection of the British Library, British Museum Library, when it was established in 1753. 2 Ethiopian manuscripts were donated that were from the collection of Robert Harley, the first Earl of Oxford. It is a fascinating book dating from the 14th century. Not much work has been done as to how Harley was able to acquire those manuscripts. So right from the start, when the British Museum was established, there was a great interest to collect antiquities, particularly from Ethiopia. Panizzi, who was then the head of the British Museum, personally encouraged items to be acquired from Ethiopia. So the first substantial acquisition of Ethiopian manuscript was a donation by the Church of England Missionary Society. Some 74, now they number up to, few have been discovered, number up to 84. Codices were collected by Eisenberg and Kraft, who were both missionary theologians who were in Ethiopia collecting manuscripts. So as a result of these manuscripts, including Harley, the first catalog was produced in 1846. And that catalog was in Latin and Ethiopic. So it was a bestseller at this time. So this substantial collection that the Church Missionary Society gave created more interest for the British Museum than to acquire manuscripts from Ethiopia. And in 1866, the Department of Oriental Manuscript at the British Museum was established. Now, it's the African Asian Studies at the British Library. The aim of this department was to acquire and catalog manuscripts in Oriental language. To this day, Ethiopia, in most cultural institutes, is actually classified as part of the Orient and not part of Africa. And this is, again, it's sort of just trying to separate Ethiopia from other parts of Africa by saying writings didn't exist in other parts of Africa except for Ethiopia, which is false. But at the British Library now, the Ethiopian collection is in the African section. Some of you might know what this image is, which has now become an iconography. It is from the movie Black Panther, where we have a character who goes into the British Museum and decides to critique their habit of collection. When the British government organized an expedition to Abyssinia, which was a punitive expedition, actually an attempt to colonize Ethiopia in 1868, the trustee of the British Museum sent an archaeologist from the British Museum by the name of Mr. R.R. Holmes to accompany this expedition. It was hoped that Holmes would collect antiquities and manuscripts along the way to the fort of Mekdala. By this time, when they reached Mekdala, the Emperor Theodore, who anglicized as Theodore. Emperor Tedros is his Ethiopian name. At Magdala, in his fort, he collected well over 900 manuscripts. Some have estimated this to be over 1,000 manuscripts from across Ethiopia, intending to build a library for endowment of the church he was building, which was the Holy Savior. The background to this conflict, you could Google this on the internet, and you can have a greater background to how the conflict started. So Emperor Tedros' collection of manuscripts were amongst one of the best in Ethiopia. The emperor was collecting manuscripts particularly to govern the kingdom of Ethiopia. And he was advised by scholars, church scholars, to seek out early manuscripts as well as illuminated manuscripts. And these manuscripts also contained government deeds as well as documents. So over the 900 manuscripts that the British forces then looted, along with many gold and ecclesiastical objects, fell into the hands of the British. Out of the 900 manuscripts, according to some archival data, 500 left Ethiopia. And out of that 500, 350 were acquired by Mr. Holmes, which is then the British Museum. Out of the 300, after the 350, now remains 349. One was returned back to Ethiopia in 1877 by the request of Queen Victoria. So the Magdala collection are one of the highlights of British Library's collection of actually religious manuscripts from non-Western manuscripts. They date between 13th century to the 20th century, as my colleague Annalisa stated. Now, these manuscripts originated from Magdala and were then transferred from the British Museum to the British Library in 1974, when the British Library was established as a separate entity, actually in 1973. The collection was originally given to the British Museum was in 1877, a huge manuscript that included well over 400 manuscripts, including the 349 manuscripts that were acquired from Magdala. In my role as a curator of the British Library, the fundamental role basically of working with manuscript collection is first to catalog and make the collection visible. Second is to develop the collection. Third, most importantly, is to safeguard the collection to the widest audiences as possible. But outside of this, the curatorial duty are vast. They cover digitization activity, assisting readers, collaboration, international collaboration, working on research projects, exhibition, conservation activities, and reading inquiries. So the purpose of also cataloging manuscripts is also to make them available for researchers and inspiration, and for people who genuinely enjoy reading manuscripts. So, so working with this collection of Ethiopian manuscripts, there are many challenges that we face. It's, as a functioning library, we need to give daily access to the material when conservation status allows us. There is also the question of exhibition, i.e. this manuscript, some of them that I've mentioned to you are museum objects, item. And so sometimes they do enter exhibition as an object or a book of the art, the binding. People are interested in all aspects of the code ecology, the material, etc. And then, of course, acquiring manuscripts as well requires constant being updated to what's out there, what relevant literature is out there, and also trying to acquire important cultural books or historical books that have now been produced. So in all of this, where does cataloging fit into this? So cataloging enables us, firstly, to develop the collection by identifying the items that we have or we don't have. Second, identifying items for exhibition and conservation for readers. We always refer to the catalogs to look up items. Items cataloged and discovered for colleagues working within reading rooms, reference, and library assistance. So there are basically three types of cataloging in the British Library. The first is the bibliographical cataloging, which is of printed book, which has its own standard. And the second is archival cataloging, which is archival documents. Again, this has its own standard and criteria. And the third is manuscript cataloging, which is codices as a manuscript working with books. It could be printed on them. Sorry, it could be written on paper or parchment, or even on metal objects. So the history of cataloging outside of the English language in Ethiopia really dates as far as back as to the 14th, 15th century. Cataloging, as well as even the concept of museum, isn't purely Western notion. As some institute explain cataloging to be a very scientific approach to the book by, but it isn't. It's actually has existed longer than the 19th century. We see in Ethiopian manuscript sometimes described in catalogs as inventory, but they contain important information about the books. As you'll see on this manuscripts where we have a list of manuscripts being described, and for example, the first parchment reads the four Gospels, including the book of Maccabees, and even expresses that some of the books had paintings or not. They contained paintings, some had gold cover, etc. So cataloging isn't a new phenomenon. So when the first catalog appeared in 1847 by Dillman, it was cataloged, as I said, in Latin and English. So for the period of its time, interestingly enough, it was the right catalog, because he was a theologian, and his interest, as well as a linguist as well, who was interested in Ethiopian language, was to cater for two types of groups: those interested in theology, church history, and in Semitic languages. So Wright's catalog to this day hasn't been yet fully translated into English. Dillman's catalog, but it's still an important point of reference. And the second catalog, which I'm going to describe and really focus here, is Wright's catalog, which really focused on the Magdala manuscript. And the last catalog, which I will briefly mention, was a catalog that was produced in 1978 by another great Ethiopian scholar, Stret Sin, who is, I consider to be really a great scholar, and his cataloging was extensive and scholarly. So the different types of cataloging that you see in the British Library and in other cultural institutes could be described as, firstly, as scholarly catalogs, where it's very analytical subject, and it has more extensive information about almost every unit within the manuscript as described. So Dillman's catalog, the first Latin catalog, as you can see here, it is limited in its information. The Latin first describes that its codex it's in 72 folia, and it lists the most important work, which is this is a praise of Mary, as you can see, Organo Mariam, and then it has the shelf mark. So the three important points in these manuscripts are variously general description and physical description. But by the time they begin to catalog the Magdala manuscript, which was a very important manuscript, and the trustees themselves have spent money on this. They hire a very important scholar who was cataloging the Syriac manuscripts, William Wright, to work on cataloging these manuscripts from Ethiopia. And at the time, according to some of his diaries, and there's an article actually coming out on Right, mostly on working on Syriac manuscript, but he does produce for the time a very important catalog. And his catalogs really, they include all aspects of the manuscript, not all aspects, but the physical description of the scroll, the parchment, whether it was on paper, skin, the foliation number, pagination, changes within the manuscript, if there is a new ending leaf, and so on. And if scribe is known, he does provide detailed information, content, colophon, ownership notes, if available, hands. And unfortunately, he doesn't look at the decoration. The example you see here is from a very important illuminated Ethiopian manuscript titled Nagara Maryam, The History of Mary, a huge manuscript that was commissioned in 1730. So right here really doesn't describe the painting, but he describes what is important for him. Doesn't go into detail how many paintings that there are in. So his catalog, his first catalog by far, was for the period was really, good, but for now it's not really that adequate. Where, as we can see here, example from Sretsin's catalog from 1878. It is a scholarly catalog. He goes through every detail, physical description, decoration. This is a specialist catalog. And the type of ornament he describes, the layout, the technical aspects, and sometimes the physical description of the binding, the dates, the sewing. And he really references manuscripts very well. And the catalog is also written in a way that is very easy for a reader to actually go and find a specific work. He even mentions marginalia. Of course, as a curator now, we're not able to produce something like this because this is time consuming, and it did take him 3 years to do this. Another example that great cataloging he does is also with scrolls. These are small magical amulet scrolls, which we have, which previous catalogers like Wright and Dillerman from their early catalogs completely dismissed. They didn't consider this anything of significance. They just described it as charms and moved on. But Wright here, Sretsin here even describes translates the illnesses or the demon associated with certain illnesses, and he was a great scholar. So when you catalog manuscripts, it is not just something we're describing, and this is an image I borrowed from the University of Hamburg, who a great number of the scholars there do cataloging on a scholarly level, and they use this sometimes to demonstrate the importance of cataloging the codex, where it's the archaeology of the book, and you're trying to get to understand sort of the important elements that make up these books. The skins of the manuscripts, the parchment used are not always gold. They could be, in some cases where I've learned recently, they could be horse, gazelle. And in one manuscript in America, which is not yet, article hasn't been published, a leopard skin was used to produce the parchment. So the manuscript as a complex object, this is how an important scholar in Hamburg by the name of Dennis Norstein describes cataloging, and it's something that could say a lot about the physical history of the manuscripts, and also the quire number, in which unfortunately, when I catalog at the British Library, I cannot spend time counting the quire number, but they tell you a lot about how the manuscript was put together, what changes occurred, since Ethiopian manuscript, like European manuscript, is made up of parchment, of bifolio, where they're sewn together. But in Ethiopian manuscript, what you get is sometimes, because of the binding style, they're able to add parchments and change parchments. So sometimes within one manuscript, you could have 2 dates of work, where we have an example at the library where we have a 16th century manuscript and it's bound with a 19th century manuscript. So all of these aspects of the codicology has to be taken into consideration when you're doing analytical cataloging. And other aspects within the manuscript are also the binding. We have here another example from the Mictala manuscript, which has the leather tooled case, but also lined with this beautiful silk fabric, which was imported to the country. This one looks like, I think, probably from Europe, but these textiles themselves, not only do we have to have a vocabulary to describe the style and of the textile, but they also tell us the dating of the manuscript. So these are things you cannot ignore. Of course, it's not just manuscripts that we're cataloging. Sumter manuscripts, for example, here we have a scroll, a 17th century scroll, beautifully decorated, which came in with this cylinder case. So this also has to be taken into consideration. So it's not just manuscripts. Another example is this copper plate, which has the Sabian inscription. Again, describing this kind of material will require certain knowledge of the history of the book, and the language is fundamental. Now to sort of take all of this cataloging that we've talked about, the sort of the practices and the detailed description, how do you translate this now into the modern digital age? In 2017, the British Library embarked on the first in-house digitization project titled Heritage Made Digital. And as part of this digitization project, the first project that was selected was the Ethiopian manuscript, in which we digitized well over 310 manuscripts and made them publicly available. Now, for the purpose of this project, my aim was to get the images online, and I wasn't able to spend a great deal of time in cataloging in details, as you've seen before. The reason being that we needed to prioritize the images first and then add the cataloging once they were uploaded. So one example is this 15th century octitude, which contains the book of Exodus right up to Ruth. And we decided that we will use rights catalogs information while I enhanced some of the points that he missed. The aim was to get this digitized on time. Now, I have also been trained to work on TEI, which is records created or edited using an extensible marked up language. For some of you who are aware of TEI, you can understand its benefits, which allows you to not just to edit work, but it allows you to collaborate. And a number of cultural institutions have begun using TEI. And at the British Library, this is something other colleagues have used, and this is something we're planning to use in the near future. So to sum up, Wright's catalogue of 1868, 1877, his approach towards the Ethiopian manuscript was a typical 18th century Englishman who was puzzled and to some extent patronizing and trying to fit everything into his own theory of the period of how to explain the manuscript. To a large extent, his description of Ethiopian manuscripts are really outdated and unsatisfactory. The problem, first and foremost, is the language he uses, which, in my opinion, are to some parts are quite racist, very dismissive, and lacking important information about the content of the manuscripts. And he would ignore certain marginalias, which have now become a subject of study in their own right. And he completely ignores the illuminated paintings on the manuscript and makes no attempt to describe them. And in fact, he describes them as effigy and uses words like crude painting. And this is quite discouraging, given that there are over 3,000 individual paintings of in Ethiopian manuscripts that we have at the library, which is quite a big collection. So it's his position as his cataloging, I would describe as being very subjective, and it makes the manuscript look significant when you compare them to, say, how the Arabic manuscript or Latin manuscripts were catalogued at the time. And it did push the point that these manuscripts were really pointless. Nothing was of an interest. So with the advantage now we have with TI, we are able to correct some of those misinformation or error in his catalog. And the other advantage of working with TI is a standard developed by manuscript specialists from Europe, Western manuscript, but they also widely apply to non-European material. So we can actually describe the book without being discriminate, and provides every tool to describe manuscript in a structured manner, starting from a general description up to very detailed information where I was explaining on the content and the codicology aspect. Unfortunately, one thing you cannot describe in cataloging is the smell of manuscripts. So with a lot of Ethiopian manuscripts, because they're parchment and some of them were used in churches, they are also a religious object. So they have retained a lot of the scent. So sometimes you can distinguish just by the smell a manuscript that belonged to a monastery and a manuscript that was owned by an individual. And the third point is the most widely used standard for academic manuscript is TI at the moment. This is in many institutions, as I mentioned, and can be used easily to provide metadata of highly and quality display, and also in image viewers working on basis of IIIF standard. And an opportunity also to catalog these manuscripts that we haven't been able to enhance before. So this allows us this opportunity. And finally, it also allows us to work in collaboration with scholars working in Ethiopia and in also in Western institutes who are studying Ethiopian manuscripts. Thank you very much.